This dialogue is meant to serve as an introduction to what reparations and what reparative justice could look like in New Haven. I am Dr. Kelly Muro, a member of the Descendants of the CT 29th Colored Regiment. The Descendants of the Connecticut 29th Colored Regiment honors the Black soldiers of the 29th Regiment who were camped in New Haven at present-day Criscolo Park. And they were a part of Connecticut's contribution to the Civil War. Fighting for freedom is in our blood. Our millennial concept of freedom is financial literacy, responsibility, employment, education, diversity, opportunity, preparedness, and maintenance of health. And these concepts are in alignment with the ideology of reparations. We are working with Amistad to focus on what reparations could look like in New Haven. Tonight's dialogue is just the beginning to this work. We have invited community members who currently serve as leaders in the focus areas of business and workforce development, Mr. Eric Clemens, criminal justice, Dr. Reginald Simmons, education, Dr. Paul White, finance, Mr. Howard K. Hill, housing, Dr. Karen Du Bois Walton, and mental health, Mrs. Enola Aird, to begin this discussion. The dialogue that you will participate in tonight is meant to create a space for us to build an understanding. This is the first step of what will be a community-owned project, meaning that the panel will not do all of this work. We hope to engage local political leaders, state politicians, business owners, but what we are most eager to do is to engage the residents of New Haven, to hear your ideas, understand your needs, and learn from how best to support improving mental health, housing, employment, education, and finance, so to address the wealth and opportunity gaps that many residents in New Haven experience due to historical racism. After addressing the gaps, we hope that together we can work with city government to remove racial disparities and empower members of the Black community. So you see, tonight's conversation is not a one and done. It is the first of several conversations that will ultimately lead to creating community investment and community ownership in the reparations process. As I mentioned, we hope to ultimately engage the full New Haven community in both conversation and activity that promote empowerment in the Black community. The dream is for all of us to collaborate in a collective contribution toward enhancement of our communities and reach our reparation goals that we set together for 2023. Thank you all for coming. We look forward to a great dialogue.
Thank you, Kelly. Good evening, everyone. My name is Kai Perry, and on behalf of the Amistad Committee, I'd like to welcome you to the first of a series of community conversations on reparations. We thought it most fitting to host this first conversation on Watch Nights, the eve of Juneteenth. Now that Congress has passed the bill to make Juneteenth an official national holiday, we must push for more than this symbolic gesture, but for substantive reparative justice. So it is our hope that you, the community of New Haven, will drive these conversations so that we may be able to advocate for an inclusive plan that reflects the opinions of all of you, including New Haven's youth, local activists, politicians, educators, business owners, our seniors, healthcare workers, day laborers, all of you. So welcome, and I'm looking forward to this riveting discussion. I have the pleasure this evening of introducing our moderator, Ms. Michelle Turner. Michelle Turner has worked as a journalist and a talk show host and moderator across 3 counties in Connecticut. She is currently the host of The Collective, a podcast airing and streaming on WSME Enlightenment Radio. Ms. Turner recently closed out a 5-year chapter with WNHH 103.5 FM LP Community Radio in New Haven, Connecticut. Ms. Turner is a New Haven native, a Black history buff, and my dear sister friend. Thank you, Michelle, for moderating this discussion this evening.
Thanks, Kai, for the warm introduction. I am so honored to be here and to do this work this evening. We'll move right into it. Our keynote speaker this evening is Dr. Philip Atiba Goff. He's a professor of African American Studies and Psychology at Yale University. He recently received his AB from Harvard and PhD in psychology from Stanford. He quickly became a national leader in the science of racial bias by pioneering scientific experiments exposing how our minds learn to associate Blackness and crime implicitly, often with deadly consequences, as we all know. He regularly appears on cable news, provides congressional testimony, and was a panelist for President Obama's task force on 21st century policing. We now welcome to the conversation our keynote speaker, Dr. Philip Atiba Goff.
Thank you very much, Michelle. Can everybody hear me okay? And I know it feels like we're almost back to real life, but we're still obviously in the midst of the lockdown, as evidenced by the fact that we're here over Zoom. Thank you, Michelle. Thank you, Kelly. Thank you, Kai. Thank you, Thomas and Daniel. Thank you to the Amistad Committee and the Descendants of the 29th Colored Regiment crew. Thank you to all the other presenters and everybody, all the staff who made this possible. And thank you to everyone else who was here and deciding to take some time to share with all of us in this conversation. I will do my best not to waste your time. So before I get started, I'll just say, I know I am well aware that I am not in a Black church, but I am always of the Black church. And that means I'm not going to ask you to say amen, though hopefully some of you will feel so moved, but I may feel like being in the space of call and response. So if y'all want to go ahead and clap at various places, if y'all want to take yourself off of mute to speak with us, that'll make me feel more comfortable. But I also want to say, normally what I would do, they ask me as a professor to come and give talks. I give PowerPoint talks, right? Or regular speech, but we're still in the midst of a pandemic with terrifying variants still taking folks out. And today is the day that we are honoring the first federal holiday to acknowledge slavery and freedom. So I thought regular stuff was ill-suited for the day. Plus, nobody wants to hear a college professor lecture over Zoom during the summer. That's what summers were invented for, so folks could stop listening to us. So instead, I wanted to take the time that was given to me to contemplate a question with y'all today. The question is simply, what is owed to those who were made legally free? What is owed to those who were made legally free? Because we're here to celebrate the day that the word of freedom reached those for whom it made a difference. Those who had dark skin, those who were descended from Africa, those who were in chattel slavery. But we're called to remember it, not because it set things right. Because Juneteenth did not say, it's not like Juneteenth happened and then racism was over. But because there is so much left to do in the long struggle towards freedom. And here's what I mean. When you wrong someone over a long period of time, it is not sufficient simply to cease the wrongdoing. If I steal from you for years and then I suddenly stop stealing, we don't call it even. I have not paid yet what I owe. And in the same vein, just because the injury occurred some time ago does not mean it has been made right. Time passing is not the equivalent of an apology, and years of silence are not compensation. But of course, the nation, the land, this city, the very university that pays my salary, were all built with labor stolen from the children of Africa on land stolen from the children of these Americas. And when the 13th Amendment was ratified, it did not compensate former slaves for their labor. It simply made them legally free. So, of course, to be legally free does not mean one enjoys the full benefits of freedom. So when we talk about being made free, that's why I say legally free, because we're not all the way made free in this country, because poverty is a form of bondage and state violence is a form of bondage. And a legal system that locks people into cages is also an eerie replication of the bondage of chattel slavery. So even after Juneteenth and the 13th Amendment, the work of abolishing slavery, the work of abolition was not finished. Instead, the country needed to embark on a period historians refer to as Reconstruction, because the way we had built our nation was so riddled with hypocrisy that we needed to build another, literally to reconstruct in the ideals that we had articulated but had never lived by. And of course, that work, the work of the period known as Reconstruction, was never allowed to be completed. It lasted roughly from 1867 to 1877 and was then stabbed through the heart by political expediency. There was a compromise. The federal government removed troops from the South, and Jim and Jane Crow settled in for a long, long, dark winter. Because this country gets tired of hearing about how much it owes to Black people. Now, there has been talk recently about the need for another Reconstruction, another attempt to reforge the nation into one that lives up to the ideals written by men who imagined them but never applied them to their own lives. The people who wrote down that all men were created equal while they held people in bondage and raped children who they claimed that they owned. The idea that we need to reforge again, because we already had a first Reconstruction, and we also had a second Reconstruction, what we call the Civil Rights Movement. But there is now talk that we need a third. But if there is a need for a third Reconstruction, as my colleague Tracy Mears says, then that means the work of abolition just is not over. And that is what I want to reckon with today. How do we get done with this project of making people free and what is owed to those who have only been made legally free? How do we get from legal freedom to full freedom? Because if we owe the formerly enslaved and their descendants their full measure of freedom and dignity, then it is clear we have not delivered on that debt as a nation. And paying the full sum of what is owed cannot be accomplished with a simple check. Though, to be clear, checks would be good. They're not going to hurt. But the barriers to full participation in the privileges of democracy must not only be obliterated, but there must be some form of compensation for the ways in which our voices were diminished. Standards of beauty must not only be redefined, but there must be some repayment for the generations who wrestled with the ghosts of hate for their own skin, features, and bodies. In other words, the unfinished work of abolition is a project. In 1935, W.B. Du Bois had a word for this project, had a phrase for this project. He called it abolition democracy. He talks about this project, this movement, as not only the need to tear down the institutions of bondage and racial oppression, but also the affirmative need to build the systems that can rid the body politic of the toxins of slavery and white supremacy. It is an affirmative duty. It is not just getting rid of the things that caused harm. It is also not just one thing. It's not just the money. It's not just the culture or the jobs or education or policy. It is a project, a huge, sweeping, enormous project, as large as the institutions of evil that caused their need. It is a way to make good on the mythology of this nation that was never real but could be. And it requires an honest accounting of what is owed, which means an honest accounting of what was taken. And it also requires prioritizing paying down those debts. That means it's not just about deciding how much was owed, how much was taken, and giving it right back, but we have to probably do this in installments. By the way, that's a conservative principle, the idea of paying down debt, a morally conservative principle championed by too few political conservatives. It also requires saying aloud that our criminal legal system was not set up to keep communities safe. It was not even set up to keep white people safe. It was set up to keep whiteness safe. We are owed these because they're part of the full accounting necessary to make payment. But there is another requirement Du Bois names, and I feel like it's important to say on this day, on this first formal day when we recognize as a federal holiday that slavery was bad, and we're glad we did something else. Too often, because the work of abolition and Reconstruction requires the naming of injuries, that full accounting of which I just spoke, and the analytic and moral clarity to name the future, it becomes a list of things that are owed without an accompanying list of actions that can be taken. And because it is perverse to blame those who are owed for not having yet received, the blueprint for abolition and Reconstruction can read like a list of demands, as if we must demand action for those from those who have power, and that demanding is the sole recourse of we who have been made free, as if we must beg or demand from those who have. But Du Bois was writing about abolition democracy in a book called Black Reconstruction. He was talking about this period from 1867 to 1877 when Black folks did the work of reconstituting the nation. It's the 1935 version, in other words. It's that language for we keep us safe. We make us free. Which is to say, there is work for those who are Black and brown, those who are native, those who are indigenous to this land to do, not because we have not done enough, but because there has never been enough done for us, and we deserve not to wait. So the question elicited by that realization is, what is it for us to do? And I should say very clearly, I am an expert on the topic of racism, on the topic of policing, on public safety. And as one of the nation's experts, I must say, what is it for us to do? I do not know. There is no expert we can turn to who can provide the moral clarity, the exact moral thing to do in this space where new futures must be imagined. But I can tell you what I tell my students who ask me that regularly, what I tell my friends, and what I say to myself when I'm not sure. I say what there is for us to do is literally anything at all, so long as it is affirmatively building those systems that rid the body politic of the toxins of white supremacy. Anything at all. But there's a trick there, because creation is infinitely harder than critique. Creating something good requires critique, but the creation part, that's just harder. To make a thing that didn't exist before is just a lot harder than to say what is should be made better. So that means if we must be engaged in the process of creation, we have to have a willingness to fail, and to fail enormously. We got to be not scared to fall on our faces and humiliate ourselves, to embarrass ourselves in the ways that we have tried to make a new thing, because the thing that we've got is not enough. It also invites us to show up for each other amidst those failures. Because if you're doing it, the best way to make sure that you feel comfortable getting back up and trying again is to know that I've got your back, that I'm not going to just set up an industry to ridicule you in the midst of the failures trying to get to what we're owed. Because to the folks failing in ways that pain you, and those failing in ways you would have tried if you have gotten there first, we got to show up with grace, with generosity, with empathy, because they are doing all that anyone can do, which is anything at all. That doesn't mean we show up without critique. It doesn't mean we show up blithely in some kind of anodyne bromide where all we do is say what you did was okay because you did anything at all. We show up with grace and generosity. We show up with critique, with an understanding that creation is harder than critique. I have something I try to do every day in this vein, which is this. I say to myself in the morning and in the evening, try to make it easier for people to do the right thing every day. Sometimes that means biting my tongue so a bigoted politician feels more comfortable voting for equity. And sometimes it means pushing my friends in areas where we disagree. But always the goal is to make it easier for people to do the right thing. Because with so very little clarity about how we get to where we agree we need to go, I do not have the arrogance to think that mine is the only way. I just know that any freedom this generation or the next will feel will come through the collective efforts of people who disagree on tactics but agree on the goal. I know if we are going to keep us safe and make us free, it will not be a smooth ride, because Reconstruction was not a unified process. And no era, no civil rights movement has ever been a unified process. But there have always been collective gains as a result of the disorganized lurch towards common cause. So when I think about what is owed to those made legally free, I think about it in these two ways. The first is the list of injuries and structures that must be paid and reconstructed. And the second is the obligations we have to each other, to move together in disharmony towards freedom. The first is more easily known, though never said often, clearly, or consistently enough, doubly so by those with the power to meet that list of demands. And the second, that is more easily within all of our control, what we owe to each other. My hope is at the end of this conversation, at the end of this moment in history, both are more possible as a result of the lives that we live. And that is how I figured we might use, or I might use, my time as the beginning to a conversation I'm greatly looking forward to. I appreciate y'all staying through this. I see that it looks like nobody on camera has fallen asleep in the midst of it, and I look forward to listening to the rest.
Dr. Goff, thank you. And no, I don't think anyone is falling asleep with that message. So we now turn to our panelists, and we start off on the realm of business with Eric Clemens. Eric Clemens is founding executive chair of Concord, an economic development and economic justice organization dedicated to community building, as well as aggressively addressing the issues wrought from poverty in Black and Brown communities. Eric Clemens, welcome. Thank you for showing up today.
Good evening,
to see you.
Michelle. Good to see you too. It's been too long.
Yeah.
And I want to first thank Thomas Thurston and Kelly Merrill for inviting me to this really important conversation. I apologize for getting on so late. I'm actually out of town, but I'm more than delighted to give voice to the very things that we all care about on this screen. So thank you. Can you hear me?
Can hear you fine. So give us 10 minutes of what you see in terms of reparative justice and reparations specifically.
Yeah, I think, first of all, very much what the keynote Dr. Goff was talking about. I think Juneteenth being about the declaration of our freedom. And at the same time, Michelle, we some of us don't realize we're free still. And I think really understanding who we are in this obligation that Dr. Goff talked about is really, really important, right? Secondly, what I'm seeing here as it relates to business are a couple of things that we need to note, but also things that are very obvious. When we talk about Black businesses in this country, 50% of those Black businesses are shuttering at this point, right? Throughout the country. And that same data is true in New Haven locally. Secondly, what's really important is how we feel about each other. Are we allowed to, as Dr. Goff talked about so eloquently, are we allowed to fail? Not only fail with the dominant culture, but fail within ourselves. We're not as forgiving as we are with each other as we are with other folks. That's really important as it relates to business. And thirdly, the idea of starting a business, a Black business, the problematic of startup capital. We have to think deeply about, if we're talking about reparations, it's not just about giving us money to put in our pockets. It's about giving us resources in a way where we can grow those resources through entrepreneurship, through Black businesses. How do we leverage money? That's really, really important because in my opinion, and I may be wrong, if in fact folks would give us $1 million check to every Black family, are we prepared to do what's right with that $1 million? Do we have the right and correct infrastructure as it relates to business to do what's right with that $1 million? I would say we do not. And so how do we, as just say New Haven, how do we create an economic infrastructure through entrepreneurship, through business? How do we create capital formation in areas of poverty like New Hallville, like Dixwell, like The Hill? How do we do that? We have to do that through each other. And in order to do that, if in fact we are going to call on or declare reparations, right, those reparations, that money has to fall into something that will allow for that money to grow, that will allow for businesses to grow. And quite frankly, when we talk about Black business, we talk about the making of widgets. We talk about all these things that are related to the mechanics of business. Yet we do not talk enough about growing business leaders, right? I've had the great opportunity and blessing to work under probably the most prolific Black entrepreneur in Connecticut, Carlton Highsmith. And so I've had I've had a glimpse, more than a glimpse, into how business is ran, how businesses are started, what it takes. It takes more credibility than it takes money. And so my job, and I'm saying this because when we talk about growing leaders, my job is to take all that I have learned and some of it that I have mastered and give that to our people, to those who would want to learn or listen. And so, you know, I want to plug what the work that I'm doing now, because it is a salient example of what I'm talking about. Right now, as the CEO of Concord, I am in the midst now of working, of course, with my team. One, we have a Black business incubator. We just purchased a 46,000 square foot building where we are going to grow Black businesses. They will be in our incubator for 2 to 3 years. They will get all the development that they need, and then we will send them out into the world a more robust and more comprehensive business. Secondly, what we're doing connected to those Black businesses, I was able to raise $350,000 and started an economic justice fund, knowing full well what I said earlier, that 50% of Black businesses are shuttering. We wanted to give $10,000 grants as seed fund and support fund to Black businesses in New Haven to give them a shot in the arm. And in addition to that $10,000, the state matched the money, where we're giving, even more important than the money, technical assistance. As we know, Michelle, a lot of our Black businesses fail, not because the people don't have the credibility, not because they don't have the commitment or the love for what they do or the passion. They fail because there are deficiencies that Black businesses either can't address or don't even know their deficiencies. And so what we're doing is hiring Black folks in New Haven to provide technical assistance to Black businesses. So people like Karen Bellamy, who has an insurance company. People like Valerie Schultz Wilson, who has a business development and consultation company. People like Mercy Quay, who is on the rise, who has a communications and social media platform. Larcena Nguyen, who will provide accounting frameworks for Black businesses. Carlton O'Neill, who will provide consultancy in business development to these Black businesses. These are the things that we are working on to not only develop, seed, and support Black businesses, but demonstrate to the world that there are greater possibilities for Black businesses than the conditions that they are wrought from. We have 3 businesses that we are running now. We have a market called Pedals Market. We have what we call Monterey Chicken, a ghost restaurant. And we also have Orchid Cafe that you know well. What I like about these businesses is that the graduates from CONCAT are now gainfully employed in the businesses that we created for them. And so these folks are not only making money, but they're learning how to run a business, almost like on-the-job training, but getting paid for it. And I think thirdly, I think when we talk about business, and I heard Dr. Goff talk about this as it related to W.E.B. Du Bois. We talk about Black business, we talk about reparations, we talk about the idea of justice for Black people, yet we don't talk about power. And I believe that Black businesses, especially entrepreneurship, is probably the priority lever to achieve power in this country. I truly believe that. And so what I'm seeing is the need for, to your original question, the need for startup capital. Like, we have to demand those things. The need for more comprehensive building business development. We can do that if, in fact, we feel obligated to each other. There's some incredible people on this panel, namely Howard Hill, namely Karen Du Bois Walton, Enola Aird. These people are incredibly smart and are dedicated to our people. And so we have to leverage the talent. We have to leverage the money. We have to leverage relationships, the relationships we have with folks who have money, again, to build these businesses. And so these are some of the things that I'm thinking about. These are some of the things that I'm doing. But at the same time, we have to know that we are free, that we can do and be whatever we want. And business enterprise is who we are. It comes from us. Farmers, they're business people, correct? Right? Corner stores, those are viable businesses. So you know, these are some of the things that I'm thinking about. You know, and I'll leave it at that, because I can ramble on and on and on.
Well, I think your rambling gives us good points, Eric Clemens. I think you're also one of the brighter people in this room, so you wouldn't be on this panel if you were not. And I got some questions for you later on in regard to some of the statements that you have made. But thank you, Eric Clemens. Appreciate your perception of what this should look like. We move on now to Dr. Reginald Simmons. And Dr. Simmons is a professor of criminology and criminal justice at Central Connecticut State University, where his teaching, consulting, and research include the retention and graduation of underrepresented college students, juvenile delinquency prevention, and culturally responsive intervention. Prior to becoming a university professor, Dr. Simmons provided direct clinical services to youth and families in schools, communities, and juvenile justice settings. So we welcome Dr. Simmons to the conversation. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you, Ms. Turner. And I want to thank Dr. Kelly Merrill for inviting me to be part of this esteemed panel. It is quite an honor. And I have to say, it was a bit of a cruel pleasure to open with Curtis Mayfield. I had a hard time not bobbing my head. So I thank you for that.
Oh, you can remember the Curtis Mayfield, or is it just something you heard in your parents' house?
Oh, no, well, you know, the young people today, I think they enjoy 90s music. I think for me, growing up, it was 70s. I want to thank you all for having me. And I want to just start with a bit of historical context and then kind of bring us forward with this discussion of criminal justice. So one of the earliest forms of law enforcement were slave patrols of the 1700s, right? And these were people that were endowed with the power to look for Black people that were seeking freedom, right? And they had the license to capture these people and bring. So this early form of law enforcement established the use of laws to oppress and control Black people. After Reconstruction and prior to Jim Crow laws, we had convict leasing, which involved the arrest and incarceration of Black people for offenses as simple as standing on a corner. They were then leased to companies to provide free labor. In essence, another way of getting the free labor that was available during slavery. We then had Jim Crow laws, as Dr. Goff mentioned, laws enforcing separation of Black people from white people. The criminal justice system was endowed with the power to arrest and jail Black people just for something as simple as drinking from water fountains designated as whites only, as we all know. Dr. Goff mentioned Reconstruction, right? So after the Civil War, during Reconstruction, federal troops helped guarantee that the rights of newly freed Black citizens were upheld. And there were some amazing gains made during Reconstruction. We had Black citizens that began to be voted into elected office, began to form businesses, they acquired land. Amazing gains during this relatively brief time of prosperity. However, due to political gain, the federal troops were withdrawn, opening the door for the onslaught of terror that was wrought on Black citizens and white sympathizers by the Ku Klux Klan, one of the first domestic terrorist organizations. This was law enforcement failing our ancestors. If those federal troops would have remained, it is possible that Jim Crow South may never have transpired. After the signing of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, the oppression continued in various forms, including the so-called war on drugs, which was really a war on Black and brown people that fueled mass incarceration. This mass incarceration did harm to many Black and brown communities and families while financing the construction of prisons and the creation of good paying jobs to support this prison industry. Nicole Hannah-Jones did an amazing job in her opening essay of the 1619 Project, chronicling how this country has been built on the backs of Black people. This includes the building and maintenance of our criminal justice system. It's a cruel sort of irony. The very tool that has historically been deployed to oppress Black people owes its very existence to Black people in the form of wealth that has been generated by the mass incarceration of Black people. White supremacy has contributed to the school-to-prison pipeline. As early as preschool, Black youth, particularly Black boys, are more closely watched for potential troublesome behavior than white children, not because of what they're doing, because no children in this study were actually engaging in potentially troublesome behavior, but because of the color of their skin. Just because of the color of their skin, they were watched more by preschool teachers than other children in this study. This implicit bias contributes to disproportionate rates of school discipline that disrupts a child's schooling and paves the way for juvenile justice involvement and increased risk of criminal justice involvement, which helps feed our criminal justice system. Again, school-to-prison pipeline that unfortunately disproportionately affects our Black and brown youth. Let's talk about our adult system for a bit. Multiple studies have found that Black adults are more likely to go to jail or prison than whites for the commission of the same crimes. And when they go to prison, receive longer sentences. Again, for the same crimes committed by white citizens. We know through multiple studies that Black men and women are more likely to be pulled over on highways and searched, even though they're less likely to have anything illegal on their care or in their possession. They get the worst plea bargaining deals, even when they cooperate with police. And of course, we have the maddening and sad dynamic of Black people reporting use of force by police more often than white people, and the all too frequent deaths of unarmed Black men and women at the hands of law enforcement. America has yet to atone for its sin of slavery and the prior and current oppression of its Black people. How can this atonement occur in relation to our criminal justice system? Well, it's complicated, but I'll take a stab at a few initiatives that could be pursued, and in some cases are being pursued. We must hold our courts, correctional institutions, and law enforcement accountable for ensuring that Black people are treated in an equitable fashion. This can take several forms. One involves more stringent hiring practices, where departments work to recruit and hire people who do not espouse white supremacy and demonstrate the ability to perform their job in a fashion that does not discriminate. At least one study has found that college-educated police officers experience fewer citizen complaints than those without a college education. So requiring some degree of higher education may help. We also need to encourage more of our best and brightest to enter the criminal justice profession by increasing starting salaries. Finally, we need to hold these institutions accountable for diversifying not only their early career staff, but leadership as well. Studies have indicated that the more diverse a police force, the more welcomed people of color feel in the department. A large department cannot have just one or two token officers of color, but many. And however, we can't even stop there. Hiring the right people is important, but it's not enough. We then need to ensure that these institutions have systems in place to hold employees accountable for their behavior. A combination of internal accountability and external accountability through civilian oversight mechanisms may make a difference. Additionally, institutions need a culture and mechanisms that encourage employees to report the bad behavior of their colleagues. Again, internal accountability at every level. We also need to ensure that institutions have robust training in implicit bias and de-escalation. I enjoyed seeing Chief Justice Robinson's implicit bias training that he provides for CSSD, Court Support Services Division. I was also pleased to hear about a police department that trained new officers in how to intervene when a fellow officer is being overly aggressive with citizens. That's part of establishing a culture very early on when you first hire an officer of what you should do when you experience this, and giving the okay for an officer to intervene when they have a fellow officer that is behaving badly. Such trainings, as well as systems that hold officers accountable for exhibiting the behavior and attitudes supported by the trainings, may go a long way. We need the trainings, but we also need to hold people accountable for implementing what they learned in those trainings. Without one, it's not going to do any good, right? You can't just train without holding people accountable for implementing what they learned in that training. In addition to these interventions, we need more alternatives to arrest and incarceration, such as more culturally relevant, high quality mental health, social, educational, and vocational services like CONCAT and CONCOR in New Haven for adults and citizens. We have to have more high quality alternatives to arrest and incarceration to support the well-being of Black people. So I want to end with what am I doing, right? Panelists were asked to talk about what they're doing. After the death of George Floyd, I suggested to the chair of my department, Criminal Justice Department at CCSU, that we need to create something more systemic that can ensure our students get a good grounding in anti-racism. before they leave us to work in the criminal justice system, which many of our students do. I worked with colleagues to conceptualize and implement a new course called Racism and Bias in Criminal Justice Settings. The course clearly met a need because it filled to capacity very quickly. And we are now going to offer this course on a regular basis. Also, I helped create and supervise a peer mentoring intervention at my university that is available to all incoming first-year students, prioritizing first-generation college students. Analyses has indicated that students who complete my program are more likely to stay in college than a comparison group of students who did not receive the intervention. And I have trained programs at other universities that focus on the success of students of color in my model. Additionally, I'm working with colleagues on a new project that involves police departments and the communities they serve, an effort to look at the relationship between police departments and the community in which that department resides. It's in the planning stages, so I can't say more than that, but I look forward to that work coming to fruition. And that's it for me. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you very much, Dr. Simmons, for your innovation in trying to bring some restorative justice through criminal justice. We appreciate it. We now turn to Howard K. Hill. Howard K. Hill is the owner and operator of Howard K. Hill Funeral Services in New Haven, Hartford, and Bloomfield, Connecticut. In 2009, Mr. Hill created the Urban Prosperity Fund, which later became singly the Prosperity Foundation. In 2013, TPF has granted tens of thousands of dollars to Black organizations throughout Connecticut, supporting their sustainability, development, and growth. Howard K. Hill, welcome to the conversation.
Michelle. I'm actually really happy to be a part of this esteemed panel. Thank you, Kelly. Thank you, Kai. Thank you, Dr. Thurston, and all those who have put this together this evening. Enjoyed the comments thus far and hope that I'm able to add some value to this conversation as well. So I was asked to talk about finance. So I'll talk a little bit about that as it relates to my business, and hopefully I can give some ideas and suggestions on what we could do as individuals to put ourselves in a better place financially. I'm sorry about that. Can you hear me? Hello?
Yes, now we can.
Yes, we can hear you fine now, Howard. Please continue.
Okay, yeah, I'm in Maryland. I'm sorry, I'm in a bad area. But what I was saying is, as a funeral director, we get a chance to meet with all people who have lost their loved ones. They could be professors, they can be business people, they can be just regular people who are just living day to day, or they can be the least amongst us. And each person has a story. Also, when it comes to funeral services, there comes a time where you have to pay your bill. And what I've noticed over my tenure as a funeral director in New Haven, especially because I spent the most time in New Haven, and then also, of course, in Hartford and the Bloomfield area, is our community tends not to be, they don't put death or paying for funeral services out in front, which I totally understand. But also, it takes a lot of us by surprise. And when it's time to pay that expense, sometimes it spins families into a crisis. So I want to encourage people to think about the importance of life insurance, burial insurance, or some kind of insurance, final expense insurance, because I do think that it's very, very important. And it would help families to be insulated from the financial strain associated with funeral services. I also think that it's important for us to talk to financial advisors so that each one of us will have the opportunity to be more fiscally responsible with our resources so that our families don't struggle. I want to stop there with that, but I want to sort of pick up on this idea of business. Really respect and enjoyed what Mr. Eric Clemens said, and what he's doing too. I think it's outstanding. I think it's absolutely what is needed. Our keynote, we talked. I do believe that, but I think that what we need to focus on is on the collective. Integration of the Black community with the we're getting now the collective and circulating monies within our own community. Nowadays, there's less talk, or I don't really hear talk about that. And I would suggest we need to I can't agree with Eric more about power. Power is not given, but power typically is taken. And one thing I know about Black folks is that we're some very, very powerful people. To be able to withstand the hundreds and hundreds of years of oppression, we're very powerful people. Mm-hmm. I would like to see us take our power back, meaning take our minds back. Because I do believe, and I believe it was our keynote who talked about, and possibly even Eric who talked about freedom. And are we truly free? I would suggest that there are many of us who may not be free, and I'm so sorry about this. This is terrible reception. But my overall hopes is that we begin to think about the collective, because I think that it's critically important for us to do that. But think about it in a different way. When you think about the wealth gap impacts Black business. Typically, with Black business, you may hear that Black people or Black businesses prices are higher. They're undercapitalized. You hear all of these different things. The services are inferior. Well, these are all, in my opinion, they are symptoms of what we have gone through as a collective, as a people. So as a collective, if we want to grow our community, there are certain things that we're going to have to address and even deal with in order to lift us up. One thing we're used to is that we are used to comfort. I believe we have been made, as a people, we have been made comfortable in our suffering. And most often that's displayed as receiving or having a really good job. When we were in our Reconstruction time, we were independent. And I think we need to strive for some level of independence. And I would suggest that it's not going to be easy. It's not going to be, I would say, bloodless. It's not going to be without someone or people losing some level of comfort in their life. And the question is, are we willing to do that? Are we willing to individually, are we willing to sacrifice to move the collective forward on an individual basis? Are we individually willing to sacrifice to move the collective forward? This is a very, very difficult conversation. I'm really, really happy that it started, but this is just the beginnings. We have to tear down racism on all fronts, even in optics. This, no disrespect to, no disrespect in any ways to Dr. Thurston or to this panel or anyone else. But one of the things that I see a lot is that there's always sort of an overseer type image. There's always something where it's like white controlled. And even if they're not, and I believe Dr. Thurston has pure intentions, the optics of it impacts the psyche, at least impacts my psyche. And I know if it impacts mine, it probably impacts someone else's psyche. So we have to figure out, how do we address all fronts? Dr. Claude Anderson always said to me, he said, racism is a team sport. So as Eric said, when funds are given to us to go into business, what we then need to do as a community is we need to make sure that these businesses stay in business. And that's where we, I believe, fall short in many ways. We reduce our Black-owned businesses to a commodity, and we look for the best price. If you're undercapitalized and you're undersupported, it's going to impact your business. I believe that business will be and is the medium of exchange of wealth. And we need to be on, as a community of people, we need to be on Team Black. And that's just the way it is. America is an idea. That's what it is. Because there are plenty of Black people who are living in America and they're prospering. And there are plenty of white, Latino, Latinx, BIPOC, whatever it is, people are enjoying the fruits of America. But there's also a subset of Black people who are still in the same boat that they've been in since we've been brought over here. It's just a different type of bondage, as our keynote talked about earlier this evening. So I want to stop there. I know I said a lot, and I know I probably ruffled a few feathers. Didn't mean to do that, but it's a difficult conversation that needs to come out. And I just want to thank you all for allowing me to speak this evening. Thank you.
And Howard Cahill, that's one of the reasons why you're in the virtual conversation, because these are the difficult conversations we need to have. By the way, for our audience, if you have any questions, statements, comments, please, now's the time to start putting them in the chat, okay? That little cartoon bubble right along the bottom of your screen is where you can type in, where it says click on the bubble in the chat that says everyone, and write your comment or write your question. We'll try to get it answered for you. Moving into education, we introduce Dr. Paul White. Dr. Paul White is currently an assistant superintendent for instruction in New Haven's public schools. Previously, he was an instructional leadership director for high schools and turnaround schools for the Waterbury Public Schools. Besides traditional settings, Dr. White is also focused on bringing sound educational practice to non-traditional education settings. As an Echoing Green Fellow, Dr. White created Young Voices Initiative, a comprehensive education and athletics program for teenagers in New Haven. Welcome, Dr. White.
Thank you, and thank you for this opportunity, and thank you to my fellow panelists. It's been a great learning opportunity, sharing opportunity, and I look forward to the continued discussion, as this is only the beginning. Speaking as a citizen of New Haven, as an educator, we know clearly that the systematic underfunding of education, the denial of education to Black people has created a substantial opportunity gap. And that is clearly, it's about the opportunity and access, not about achievement, because our Black students can achieve the way anyone else can. But it's been framed in such a way as an achievement ability to white counterparts unable to achieve the same. But as our speakers earlier have talked about, a lot of that is tied to the economy, because we have schools, and I do have to apologize, I am in the Bushnell and there is a memorial service with a performance going on, so I do apologize for the background music. So as I was saying, it ties to economy, because the underfunding of schools has been related to not providing the funding based on having property-based taxes as the way of funding school districts. So you have the redlining that created in Black neighborhoods that created less ability for schools to have money. And that has trickled down to the point where we have such an underfunded system and continue to have that. Here in New Haven, we know we have a great deal of work, not only on the funding side, but also on the racial equity side. We need to do a lot of work looking at this through a racial equity lens and how we can do that, and where reparations could play a role in that. So some of the areas that I have thought about that we need to work on is really, how do we create an equity lens in the funding system for schools? How do we really reestablish what we teach in our curriculum? Because a good portion of this has also been the whitewashing of our curriculum, whitewashing of the history that's taught. Many students have not been taught about Juneteenth or the meaning of that. So those are the things that have to be retaught. So the other ways of doing that include obviously trying to get more Black and Latino educators in our school system, revamping what we do in our teacher education programs so that this is not something that has to be learned on the job, so that teachers can have that space to come in and learn about critical race theory, come in with that lens to begin with, as opposed to having it to be retaught. And as Dr. Goff talked about, some of his research about how Blackness is linked to criminality, we have to address our discipline system within schools, even how we structure what happens in keeping order in schools, which is that balance between safety of students, but not policing and over-policing of students. So those are some of the areas that we need to really see how we can go about this. Continuing along the line about discipline in schools, it's really the issue, obviously, our Black boys are generally disciplined harsher than any other group, or Black girls equally being disciplined more, which is creating that school-to-prison pipeline. So those are areas that we have to reform, and through reparations, really rework how we look at policies, how we think about these pieces, rethink all of the things that have been the zero tolerance. Even when you have related to some of the criminal justice issues, some of the things that were put in place were saying things about what happens within 500 feet of a school. You only have 500 feet of multiple schools when you're in urban districts. You don't have that in our suburbs. So all of those things relate to what happens, how we work towards how we can do better by our kids so that they can succeed. Some other things can be true development, again, for current teachers about critical race theory, about culturally responsive pedagogy, how to work in a majority Black and brown district, how to work with majority Black and brown students. Those are things that need to be done. Ideally, it would be great to have more and more educators, but the effects of what many students have seen have turned students away from the field of education. It used to be a very honored profession that all Black educators would be part of, and many desire to be a part of that. But the degradation of the work has made it hard to be part of that community. So again, continuing along those lines, we really need to use any type of reparation to support improvement in our curriculum, provide ways and opportunities for there to be money to fill gaps in funding so that we don't have schools that get more money because they're in predominantly white neighborhoods. And we also have to work with that and bring it to the level of New Haven. We have to work on the perception and difference in our schools. Many of us here either went to or connect to or love Hill House High School. But Hill House High School is frequently thought of as an underperforming poor school, and some people in the neighborhood that's zoned to go to Hill House will try to go to Wilbur-Cross to an honors program that never existed there because they didn't feel they could go to Hill House. And Hill House has as much to offer as Cross, as much to offer as many of our schools. So there's inside intra-district work that has to be done to build and fix inequities. And then there's the work we have to do across all of our schools so that our students can succeed. We need to reinvest in money to allow students to be able to go to college. Really, if we were talking about reparations, creating paths so that students can receive the higher education, the skill training, the job training that's needed to live a healthy life in the 21st century as we go forward. So those are the things that I believe are essential to making education work. It's the acknowledgement that there have been inequities, and then now how do we truly fix that? What are the concrete steps we do? And some of those things that I've talked about is part of that path to go forward.
Thank you, Dr. White, and looking forward to hearing more about how you connect that pipeline from high school to jobs for our youth. Very interested in that. Thank you. Dr. Karen DuBose Walton was raised by civil rights era activists who instilled in her the values that she carries with her each and every day: a focus on inclusion and equity, a vision not only of what's true, but what could be possible, and a drive to achieve what's possible through commitment to action. For the past 14 years, Dr. Du Bois-Walton led Elm City's Communities, the housing authority of the city of New Haven. She has recently left that position to run for mayor of the city. Good evening, Dr. Walton. How are you?
Good evening. So nice to be with you. Thank you all for being here. I'm going to take us through a quick journey of housing policy and want to start with really calling out some of the patterns that we see. The housing patterns of today, where we see Black and other families of color concentrated in urban settings, where those urban settings tend to be under-resourced settings, where we see white families overrepresented in suburban settings, in typically better resourced communities, where we see an over-representation of Black and Latino and other families of color in public housing authorities and government subsidized housing, where we see tremendous home ownership and wealth gaps between Black and white families, some of the things that have been touched on already this evening. Let's know that that is not an accident, that there is nothing genetic or cultural about Black folks that say they want to live in cities in under-resourced areas. And there's nothing genetically predetermined about white families that moved them into suburban settings. But that these are all things that what we see today in our housing patterns are the result of decisions of policymakers and government officials that predate us, but that have their long-lasting tentacles into today and shape what housing patterns look like in our communities to this day. And let's be very clear that that design, that thing that happened not by accident, happened with very clear discriminatory intent. That the decisions about who could live where and who could not live where, and what was resourced and what wasn't resourced, and what could be done in what neighborhoods and what couldn't, what was cited, where liquor stores and other things associated with challenges in urban centers, that all those decisions were decisions that were intentionally made legacy of anti-Blackness, the legacy of slavery, the legacy of Jim Crow that continued in new and improved ways with the same intent of the original sins of this country around the ownership of bodies. And so as we moved from slavery to Jim Crow, as we moved from Jim Crow to civil rights era, the very intent to ensure that certain members of our community had access to wealth and that was associated with whiteness, and that the lack or the deprivation of wealth and the intent to keep people in poverty was very much associated with anti-Blackness in the governmental policies. It's necessary for us to understand that, to understand where we are today and to frame our discussion about reparations within the realm of housing. So as we moved out of explicit Jim Crow time, we saw government begin to use zoning and land use and banking and governmental housing policy as the way to keep groups separated and as a way to ensure that certain communities grew in certain ways while others grew in different ways. Very clear on the books legal discrimination. And it's important to call that out because otherwise it could be easy to dismiss what we see today as something intrinsic to the communities. Or it could be easy to dismiss what we see today as just the mind of some evil or racist banking person who said, you're going to get a mortgage if you are white and you're not going to get a mortgage if you're Black. But that would be too simple because what we saw instead was structural and systemic racism that was created and enabled by our government. And as somebody who's worked in housing for 14 years, I can't do my work without recognizing that legacy, that history, because failing to recognize that would put me in a position of knowingly or unknowingly continuing things that perpetuate a system that I instead choose to try to dismantle in different ways. So let me bring you through Connecticut's history really quickly. Connecticut began in 1920 with laws on the books around zoning. And Connecticut's original zoning act, again in 1920, was meant to ensure that multifamily, or what we think of as apartment structures, could exist only in city areas close to factories and were not allowed to develop in areas farther away, which were the areas that white families were beginning to migrate to. Because if you think about city development and urban development, people originally lived close to their jobs, and the jobs in this area tended to be manufacturing, industrial, factory level jobs. And as the government began to create pathways, the pathway to allow families to move farther and farther away from their jobs were created only for white families and not for Black families. The pathway to wealth was created only for white families and not for Black families. And so as early as 1920 in Connecticut zoning law, you see the beginnings of practices that ensured that those who had less wealth and less access to wealth, Black families, were not going to have opportunity to move into neighborhoods that were beginning already at that time to be better resourced. We then see the Great Depression hit and the acts of recovery of the government that were in place to help people recover from the Depression. And again, we see the ways in which the government ensured that the path to recovery was only for white families and explicitly ensured that Black families could not have access to the kind of mortgage programs that were developed for white families at that time. Explicitly for white families, explicitly not able to write mortgages for Black families. And you see around 1937 that the government did decide, well, we do have to do something about affordable housing and something about eliminating slums. And you see the beginning of the public housing movement. And as early as 1938, here in the city of New Haven, we had a housing authority. And housing authority here and like other places created housing, typically segregated housing, so that white families and Black families lived separately, but in what was considered subsidized workforce kind of housing. And then you begin to see clear pathways created for white families to move up and out of public housing in our city. And you see Black families and other families of color explicitly left behind. And that again became a path of home ownership, where post-World War II, you started to see investment in suburbs, government designing suburbs, again, explicitly for white families, mortgage programs explicitly for white families. You saw redlining, actual maps where lines were drawn around the areas that had Black concentration, where government said, you will not invest in these areas. And bankers looked at those maps and said, we will not write mortgages. We will not allow for business development, business loans to do things in these neighborhoods because they have Black families in them. Black families with the same wealth, the same ability to buy a home, were not allowed to buy a home in the suburbs that were being developed for white families. And so we see these pathways out into suburban communities for white families. And you see the pathway for wealth creation, because we know in this country, business development, finance, wonderful conversation, but we know in this country that home ownership is the primary way that families build wealth. And we see government making explicit steps to make sure that that wealth creation is only for white families and not for Black families. Civil rights era comes, we get the Fair Housing Act in 1968, and the government saying that this is no longer fair to do things in that explicit way. But the damage had been done. Like Dr. Goff said in the beginning, Professor Goff said, it's not enough to just say, now we'll stop the discriminating, now go forth and be equal. The reality is the damage in the wealth gaps had been created, the damage in terms of who owned houses and who was left in rental housing had already been created. When we think about the fact that homes that were built with government subsidy for white families in the 40s and 50s, homes that sold for $5,000 to $7,000 to buy a home, wouldn't we love that today, are now valued at $400,000 and $500,000. That is wealth, that is equity that was enabled by our government for white families. And that is equity that was explicitly kept from Black families who were denied the opportunity to buy those homes at $5,000 to $7,000. And so now white families who've had generations to pass on that increased equity, that the money that they developed over those years of taking a property that was purchased by their family for $5,000 that now values at $400,000 to $500,000. That welfare has been used to start businesses. It's been used to finance college education for their children. It's been used to pass wealth generationally, while Black and brown families were left with rent paying in often substandard housing in under-resourced communities without an opportunity to build wealth. And so by the time the government decides to fix it, the problem is deep and comes around with programs like voucher programs and things that say, oh, you can go anywhere and live anywhere. But at this point, we've developed communities that have no opportunity to go take your voucher and rent in a Woodbridge, because Woodbridge has very explicitly decided not to create an opportunity for rental housing. And so when we think of that, we say, well, what must happen for reparations? We have to take some intentional action, because we are either continuing the racial disparities, that is, we are continuing to be racist, or we are taking explicit steps to eliminate the racial disparities, to dismantle the systems that created them, that is, we can choose to be anti-racist. So what do we have to do? One, we have to do intentional investment in the communities that have been home to Black and brown families that intentionally were deprived of wealth and access. And that's why efforts like Eric Clemens at Concorp are so important. It's why the work we've done at the Housing Authority to rebuild our entire portfolio is so important, because we cannot walk away from the city. We must make investment and create opportunity there. Second, we have to create pathways into these communities that have so successfully closed their doors to Black and brown families. We have to create pathways into these suburban communities. And it's not enough to just say, you're now free to go buy the $500,000 house, when we've never given you an opportunity to build the wealth to get there. And so we have to start by creating opportunities for affordable rental housing and affordable home ownership pathways into those communities, so that folks can stabilize, pay a rent, pay an affordable mortgage that will allow them to build the equity that will allow them to purchase their second home, their larger home potentially in those communities. And so that's why we fight for zoning change and home ownership programs, and also fight to do the hard work in those communities, in suburban communities, to make them welcoming to families. And third, we have to have the conversation about individual reparations, because these systemic things did harm to individual people. These systemic things created wealth and deprived wealth for individual families, families for whom the legacy has carried on to the generations we see today. And so we have to ensure access to wealth that is equivalent to that which was denied. That house that sold for $5,000 in the 40s that we couldn't get, that's now valued at $500,000. That's wealth denied to us that needs to be transferred to us in a way. We have to look at things like, how can we get the acquisition of properties and then sell them at a price point that families can afford right now, create affordable home ownership opportunities for folks. We have to transfer that wealth, where people will automatically get some equity at the beginning of their home purchase. We have to think about the ways in which access to capital can actually, we could actually create access to money that others use their home equity to fund. And so we have to think about how we're getting Black and brown communities have access to college, money for college and money for small business development, and think about that in the reparations frame. Because again, our counterparts were able to finance that for their children based upon that equity that was created by government. And lastly, we have to think about how we are stabilizing housing costs for the very essential and important home-based businesses that can grow in our communities and in our home by coming up with unique reparations-rooted kinds of initiatives that can allow our home-based childcare providers and folks who are running businesses out of their homes around personal care services and those kinds of things, how we do that in a way that creates an opportunity for them to treat their home as their business and get access to capital for that. We have an opportunity to undo what has been done through housing policy and create a pathway into wealth for our community. And it is a prime opportunity for us to have this conversation around reparations as a wealth builder in our community.
Thank you, Dr. Du Bois-Walton. Very interesting perspective as far as housing and giving us a history of housing in Connecticut. We appreciate that.
Thank you.
Moving on to mental health. Enola Aird is a lawyer, activist mother, founder and president of Community Healing Network. Enola is a Phi Beta Kappa graduate of Barnard College and earned her JD from Yale Law School. a former corporate lawyer. She has worked at the Children's Defense Fund and is past chair of the Connecticut Commission on Children. We welcome you, Enola Aird. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you, dear Michelle, and good evening to everyone. It is wonderful to be a part of this conversation and with sitting side by side virtually with these truly brilliant and committed people. I am here to outline a case for emotional reparations, which I believe to be essential to restore and promote the psychological, the spiritual, physical, and behavioral health of Black people. I come to this table as a mother in the long line of Black mothers who over the past 6 centuries have brought our children into a world that profoundly devalues their lives. A world that generally considers them to be less beautiful, less lovable, less intelligent, less capable, less worthy, less valuable than white children. A world in which they are seen as dangerous and are more likely to be killed than white children. The question is why? Because in the words of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., somebody told a lie one day. They made everything Black, ugly, and evil. The centuries-old lie of white superiority and Black inferiority is the most powerful weapon ever formed against Black people. It is the greatest crime against our humanity and a source of profound pain and emotional, spiritual, and cultural damage that has undermined the health and well-being of Black people for generations. The lie was told starting in the 1400s to justify the enslavement of African people and the exploitation of Africa, the richest continent in the world in terms of natural resources. But before the 1400s, Africa was, according to the historian Henry Louis Gates up the road, the home of civilizations. Africa was the home of civilizations as splendid and glorious as any on the face of the earth. But to enrich themselves, Europeans erased Africa's rich history and replaced it with the lie of white superiority and Black inferiority. They created our ranking of humanity with white people at the top and Black people at the bottom, and all too often not part of the human family at all. The lie was an instrument of cultural imperialism that imposed European cultural values on African people. And the result has been multi-generational cultural trauma caused by a direct assault on the integrity of African values, practices, and identity, supplanting African standards of ethics, philosophy, psychology, aesthetics, and spirituality in favor of European standards. This has led to major disruptions and a profound crisis of meaning and identity for Black people. For 600 plus years in the world and 400 plus years here in the United States, we Black people have been living our lives under a narrative that was written for us by white people to serve their interest, and at the root of that narrative is the lie. The vicious stereotypes that frame Black people as less than human are the product of that lie. These stereotypes have adversely shaped the nation's perceptions of us and far too often our perceptions of ourselves. Those stereotypes have persisted over the course of centuries, and as a result, the advantages conferred by whiteness and the disadvantages imposed by Blackness have been multiplying across time, leading to the gross racial disparities in nearly every area of life that we see today. A 2019 policy statement from the American Pediatric Association concluded, and I quote, "The stress generated by experiences of racism may start through maternal exposures while in utero and continue after birth with the potential to create toxic stress. This transforms how the brain and body respond to stress, resulting in short and long-term health impacts on achievement and mental and physical health." We see the manifestations of this stress as preterm births, low birth weights in newborns, to subsequent development of heart disease, diabetes, and depression as children become adults. Every Black child born in the last 400 plus years in these United States has had to make the best out of living under a emotionally damaging anti-Black Eurocentric narrative fueled by the lie. Against that backdrop, just think how amazing we are. In spite of all that, carrying that heavy weight every single day, how we have risen to the occasion. But we've had to fight very hard for every piece of ground. And the price that we have paid engaging in this constant struggle has been enormously damaging, emotionally and psychologically. The greatest damage done by the lie, as far as I'm concerned, can be seen in the way it has undermined our ability to fully love ourselves and each other. All too often, it undermines our ability to fully love what we see in the mirror and to walk with confidence, utmost confidence in this world. That is, in my view, the heart of the crime against our humanity. Black people can only be made whole through the work of emotional reparations, work that we, Black people, must lead, and work that a good government and good allies can support financially. Emotional reparations is quite simply everything that will be needed to repair completely the generation upon generation of emotional and psychological harm inflicted on our ancestors, on us, and our children. The lie casts Black people out of the circle of humanity. That is why our struggle as Black people is about much more than racial justice. It's about restoring our dignity and humanity as people of African ancestry and reclaiming our rightful place in the circle of humanity. In order to do that, we have to go through a process of emotional repair. Community Healing Network is leading the global grassroots movement for emotional emancipation, healing, wellness, and empowerment, which is a comprehensive program for emotional repair as a foundation for optimal Black wellness. Our signature initiative is the Emotional Emancipation Circle, a psychologically sound, African-centered self-help support group process developed in collaboration with the Association of Black Psychologists. And through EE circles, we are freeing ourselves and our children from the toxic Eurocentric narrative grounded in the lie, and we are co-creating a renewed African narrative defined by the truth of Black people. Essentially, we are getting back into our righteous minds. This nation and the businesses who benefit from the enslavement of Black people do have a moral obligation to help repair the damage they have caused. But it's important for those in the movement to center the historical and continuing emotional damage caused by the lie. CHN is happy to work with this group or any other group in this community over the next 2 years to help build an ecosystem for optimal Black wellness with EE circles at its foundation. What others may do, we're self-reliant, we're self-determining Black people. Whatever others may or may not do to meet their moral and or financial obligations to us, the basic work of emotional reparations depends on us. That is the premise of the movement for emotional emancipation. And so we, Black people, will do this essential work following in the footsteps of our amazing ancestors who made a way out of no way. I never want to stop talking about them because they are our strength.
And we thank you, Enola Aird, for the enlightenment. And want to say thank you to all our panelists for the interesting and intriguing information in this first of conversations on restorative justice and reparations. Want to thank Thomas Thurston, Dr. Thomas Thurston, Daniel Vieira of the Gilder Lehrman Center for the Study of Slavery and Resistance and Abolition at Yale University, Meredith Benson of the Elm City Juneteenth celebration, the Amistad Committee, the Descendants of the Connecticut 29th Colored Regiment, and the Planning Committee for this evening's event, Meredith Benson, Roz Hamilton, and Dan Richardson. And don't forget, there is a celebration of our newly minted holiday, Juneteenth, this coming Saturday, tomorrow, from 12 to 5 at 230 Ashman Street, just off Dixwell Avenue, historic Dixwell in New Haven, Connecticut. We are now going to take questions from our virtual audience. So if you do have questions regarding anything that you've heard, or if you have some statements that you'd like to make at this time, please do so. Put them in the chat. I'll read them back to our panelists, and then we'll have a formidable, I'm sure, discussion. And the chat is that little box that has the little cartoon-like little bottle over it. You can use that. Put your chat in there, comments. I have a question. And this is a conversation that has been floating around my friends, my family. Is reparations our responsibility? Because we have come to the table ever since we've been in this country, and we as African Americans, descendants of enslaved peoples, have always come to the table with solutions. Those solutions were either partially used, picked apart, or not used at all. So I'm paraphrasing Toni Morrison here by saying, is it really our responsibility? Because we didn't create it. So we certainly should not be the ones to always have a solution for it. So your thoughts, panel?
I'll jump in on that. I think, we are experiencing a system that was designed by others, not with our best interest intent, best interest as the purpose of that. And who better to determine one's destiny than those most impacted, right? There's that expression about those who are closest to the pain should be closest to the solutions, or closest to the power. And I would say no better, right? I love Professor Goff's frame of this. It brought a sense of grace and humility to the sense that we are dreaming into and building into a world that we have not yet seen. And we need to bring the creativity and the imagination and the vision and the sense of equity and the sense of liberation that is so much a part of our story into solutions. And so I would say, absolutely, we cannot cede our power to anyone else to build a system that we think is going to best benefit this community. And when we build something that dismantles this deep-seated anti-Blackness, and build a system that will actually value that, we will build a system that will value all. And so I would say it absolutely is something that we want to be in the driver's seat around dismantling old and dreaming into and building something new.
I appreciate that, Karen. And Michelle, if you'll allow me to just hop off of that or add on to, I'll just say it's important to make a distinction between responsibility and blame, right? We are for sure not to blame for the fact that it hasn't happened yet. We won't be to blame if it doesn't happen within our lifetimes, and we won't be to blame if it never happens. But we are going to end up being responsible for it, because when in the long struggle of this country to live up to its ideals, has that ever gotten done without Black folks driving the bus? It's never happened, right? Those who are in the most vulnerable positions have to get it done simply because those who are comfortable have never been willing to. So I don't want to blame us. I don't want to take on the extra burden and say that we are the only ones who could be responsible, but I do want to empower us to say that if we choose to, that's going to be how it happens. And I got to say, I come from this from a perspective of doing early activism in trauma. If you have a family where there's a child who's been traumatized, it's unreasonable, it's cruel, it's abuse to say they are the ones who have to get you out. But often it is the case that in a family where trauma has afflicted the most vulnerable, they're the ones who are the most powerful at getting to healing. So if we separate responsibility from blame, we can be a little bit more clear that we don't have to take the burdens, but we do have the power in our hands.
All right, and with that, we'll look to questions in the chat. This one is from Meredith Benson. And she says, is the lack of home ownership where one could pull capital a contributing factor in allowing folks to have access to startup money for new businesses? Is home ownership more than having our own patch of grass, but a true path to wealth? If so, how do we support more residents in New Haven, and I suspect across the country, on their journeys to home ownership and becoming venture capitalists?
Home ownership is absolutely the strongest wealth creator in this country. This is a country that's been built on ownership, on in our history, it's been built on the ownership of people, of us, of our ancestors, but it's been built on the concepts of property ownership and home ownership as the way in which wealth is created. And in very intentional ways, that was created for communities that did not look like us and deprived from our community. And we see the remnants of that today in the huge wealth gaps. But we also see it even in existing home ownership today, where you will see that comparable homes that are in predominantly Black neighborhoods are undervalued and appraised at less than that same home in a white community. And that same home, when perceived to be owned in a mixed or in a predominantly white community, that same home that's presumed to be owned by Black folks, as appraisers go through and see things that seem to imply that this is a Black-owned home, that same home will be valued and appraised less than when the appraiser goes through and thinks that it's owned by white folks. So we see in so many ways the continued disparities in wealth that are rooted in anti-Blackness and racism and home ownership. So I would say yes, the way in which people use the value of their home and leverage the value of their home to be able to access capital and get them into business ownership opportunities and finance of higher education and to pass that wealth on to the next generation is absolutely one of the ways in which that wealth gap has continued to grow and accelerate over the years. And so I think we have an opportunity to, in a reparations frame, to think about ways in which we are creating opportunity for home ownership in undervalued neighborhoods and for Black and Brown residents. And I think we have an opportunity through a reparations frame to think about that. I think through a reparations frame, we have a way of thinking about how the government might obtain properties and have them in shape for families to buy, but sell them at a price point that is well below what the market would, because that again recognizes the fact that government played a role in us not being able to acquire the wealth and get that same opportunity back in the 40s and 50s. And if you were to buy a home that's valued at a certain level, but at a price point below that, you walk into that home with automatic equity that we should have today, equity we should have had in the past that we can get today. And so I think there are reparations models around how you structure home ownership and home acquisition. I think we have homeowners in our community right now who are struggling to make ends meet and not able to invest in their property to the level that we may want. That's an opportunity for reparations as well. The way in which we have money available for home improvement, for beautification in neighborhoods, for neighborhood investment. That's a place for reparations, I think, as well also.
Thank you for that. Yes, go ahead, Eric.
Yeah, I think also we need to make the distinction between wealth and wealth building and business, right? That business and entrepreneurship especially, you may not get wealthy. Not every Black person will be wealthy, right? But business and entrepreneurship gives you freedom, right? Freedom to dream and freedom to be. And so the idea of working for oneself and creating jobs for folks who look like you in your community is a very powerful mechanism, right? And a very powerful demonstration, especially to the generations behind us and to those who have yet to be born. And so Karen is absolutely right that home ownership is the lever for wealth generation, wealth building. And entrepreneurship is a lever for a sense of freedom or a sense of freedom of being and doing. And so that's really, really important, right? A lot of times, justice to me means that we have enough, not that we're all wealthy, right? The idea of having enough is a powerful mechanism. It really is. So I think that's really, really important to create a distinction between wealth generation, wealth building, and entrepreneurship and having power, right? Because to me, and I'll repeat this, and I appreciate all the shout outs about Concat and Concord from Dr. Simmons and Howard and Karen. But for me, it's really, really important that we ground this conversation in the acquisition of power.
Thank you. Don Richardson says, thank you for tonight's reparations forum. Locally, it's ironic that today's top news story of Connecticut legalizing marijuana has already missed the mark regarding reparative measures for New Haven people of color arrested on marijuana charges. Connecticut's governor refused to sign off on provisions of the bill that would have allowed people convicted of marijuana crimes to erase their criminal records and also get prioritized opportunities in Connecticut's emerging legalized marijuana business. Where's the outrage, he says, and community mobilizations related to reparations and the current legalized marijuana approval by the state? Where's the accountability of our community's leaders on this very timely issue before us?
On the question of where's the outrage, I get that question a lot because I am daft enough to be on social media. And I'd like to say that the outrage is busy, right? It's busy doing a lot of different things. There's plenty to be outraged about. Whereas the organizing, my hope is, it's a great question. My hope is that folks decide to get organizing themselves, because it only takes 2-3 people to write a letter, start getting folks to sign it, and move it up. Because that framing is exactly right. There was an immoral law that was targeted towards vulnerable Black communities. And now we've decided that because there's a group of white people who like it, we're going to make it legal. And in fact, it's going to be a business boom. How on earth do we have people incarcerated for doing the same thing that's going to be a multi-billion-dollar industry on the other hand? So the framing is exactly right, but it can't be up to other people to get it done. We got to do that, right? So I'll say that the center that I run, the Center for Policing Equity, we have been trying to get communities in front of the folks who have the power to do this. We're trying to lobby folks in the marijuana industry to do things like prioritized hiring in the neighborhoods that have been targeted for surveillance. In fact, the neighborhoods that are continuing to arrest folks for something that they know they can't get convicted of later. But it's not going to happen until folks who live in those communities are in charge of, are actually doing the organizing themselves. So if you've got the question, that means you've got the vision to be that leader. My hope is that everybody on this call understands that too.
Thank you, Dr. Goff. Kay Overton says, as a Black woman who grew up and was educated during the civil rights era in an HBCU, and who eventually became one of the many first who entered the corporate workforce, I witnessed the changes that came as a result of changes the era evoked. However, not long into these changes that were supposedly designed to elevate African Americans into long denied positions in corporate America, as well as management opportunities, I witnessed a marked increase in these opportunities to white women as the favored so-called minority class, which catapulted them into top managerial positions instead of those of us for whom it was designed, especially Black women. My question is, how will we avoid having the same thing occur in the reparations suggestions that she is hearing tonight? Anybody?
I certainly don't pretend to have I'm leaning into the grace and humility of Professor Goff, right? We're trying to envision something that's never been done here before. But when I'm speaking of reparations, I'm speaking very clearly about reparations for the descendants of enslaved folks in this country. And so I'm being pretty targeted when I'm talking about that.
So if I may, part of what I heard in the question is from a version of what we heard from the prophet Dave Chappelle a number of years ago, right? In terms of, all right, so even if Black folks get all this money, where are we gonna spend it? Like, how do we make sure that the economic systems redound to the benefit of Black folks continuously, as opposed to just extracting value and extracting labor from Black communities, which is what's been going on in racial capitalism in the United States since the beginning. And I'll say again, I don't know, but this is part of the reason why Black business, Black industry is necessary, but it's also part of the reason why you have to have a critique of capital at the same time that you've got a critique of racism, because they're tied up in the same set of systems. And if we're saying that poverty and the criminal legal system, which are part and parcel of the same thing, are part of the unfinished business or the legacies of slavery, then we're not going to get out of one without talking about the other. And it's a hard problem, because you can't just erect parallel Black businesses. Separate but equal didn't work back when. It's not working now either. So it's a hard problem, but it's a worthy problem to engage.
Indeed. Catherine Jackson is asking Enola Aird, could you speak a bit more about the big lie?
It's the water we swim in, it's the air we breathe, it's what we're born into. It is the root of all the other lies, right? All the stereotypes about Black people, all the things that we are really imprisoned by, burdened by. It's the reason, it's what is inside people's heads, people who police our communities, who will, on too many occasions, shoot us many more times than is necessary to subdue any living thing. It is a lie that is under the surface of all the, nice words that we say. Today we're all celebrating Juneteenth and the celebration about the signing of this new act. Well, that's more of the same, and it looks good, but underneath the surface is the big lie that we've really not confronted over the course of these many centuries. And so our argument, quite simply, is that we have to, one, name it. Anti-Black racism is a big thing. We're interested in looking at the root cause of that. We're interested in seeing it as the thread that runs through the whole fabric of anti-Black racism. And we're interested in finding all the places where that thread is, so that we can begin to pull at it to unravel the whole fabric. So we're very insistent on talking about root cause, because it is the thing that determines so much of the horrible things that we have to contend with as people of African ancestry.
Thank you for that. We've got a couple of more questions, so I hope the panelists don't mind us going just a tad bit over 8 o'clock. Rosalind Hamilton asked the question, what do you think the city should be doing in Newhallville, in New Haven, to prevent the elimination of the Black home owning community?
Is that question
Walton and Eric?
Yeah,
that can be between the two of you.
I mean, I'm sure Karen's answer will be more qualified than mine. I have a question. Is that question regarding Black folks who are losing their homes? I know there is a groundswell of folks who are coming into Newhallville who are taking or buying properties, and most of those properties were not owned at the time. And quite frankly, and this is not a plug, but we are actively purchasing homes in Newhallville to rehab those homes and put them back into the market as affordable rental homes. And so I think that, again, our work should be about creating economic infrastructure and capital formation in Newhallville and Dixwell and other areas in New Haven that have been impoverished for quite some time. I think there should be, and Karen can answer this better than me, there should be some home ownership plans and rescue or what have you. But I really don't know if the person is asking the question in relation to folks who are losing their homes, maybe due to the pandemic, or homes that have been vacated and now being bought by folks from outside of that demographic, of that geographic. Karen, I'll yield to you.
Eric, I would guess that all of that is in that question. I think
yes, I would think so.
We see folks, right, with economic challenges and coming out of a pandemic and a time of great economic disruption has even increased the potential for foreclosure and housing instability. So I think we certainly have that happening. We have this push around gentrification and this sense that our neighborhoods are not worthy of investment for Black and brown folk to live in them, but they become worthy of investment when pushing out those who've been there and bringing in new communities. That happens far too often. We have I got a number of friends who are mortgage qualified, have their down payment in this market right now, who are consistently getting outbid on 10, 15 offers that they're putting in by investors who are buying these not to live in the community, but to buy them as investment properties to rent out. And so that's putting a challenge on the housing market. And I think we have some opportunities to do some things around these things that get neighborhoods, that get development to be done closer to neighborhood level. We have too many of these parcels that are being assembled into huge parcels that no local developer is going to be able to develop and keep that wealth in this community, and ends up being developed by larger, typically out of the city, out of the state developers. We have an opportunity to do smaller size development that actually creates opportunity for local folks to develop property that could be sold and kept in this community. So those are some opportunities that are in front of us right now. We have an opportunity to think in this reparations frame about how we get renters to be the first ones who have a shot at buying the property when the property they're living in goes up for sale, again, to stabilize home ownership. We have opportunity through reparations to really incentivize owner-occupied purchasing in our communities. And I think we have an opportunity to support the existing homeowners with some of the things I talked about before that will help people invest in their properties. That people that are long-term homeowners but living on stretched economics that don't allow them to make the major capital improvements that go along with being a homeowner. And I think we have an opportunity in a reparations frame to make some of those investments as well, so that we can maintain the home ownership levels we have in a place like New Hallville and increase that. More and more owner occupancy will do everything to stabilize and increase the value in those communities.
This from Antonia Edwards. She says she truly appreciates the panelists. What is recommended as ways to build the trust and interest of Black people in the underserved communities? And then she goes on to say, solidarity has been extremely instrumental in getting legislation bills such as SB-1 racism as a public health crisis and HB-6107. Is there interest from the panelists to establish a coalition to be a part of the commission to study the effects of U.S. American Black chattel slavery on the descendants of Black American chattel slavery to date? I know that's a mouthful, but there's two questions there. One, I'll repeat, what is the recommended ways to build the trust and interest of people in the Black underserved communities? That's question number one. The second question is there an interest from the panelists to establish a coalition to be a part of getting some legislation to study the effects of Black chattel slavery on the descendants of Black American chattel slaves?
Yes to question two.
I'll take on a question, the first part of that question, which as I understand it is, how can we gain trust and interest in community? I think what's important is for those that want to support the improvement in the well-being of Black communities to not think you have all the answers, but to come in and be willing to listen and talk to people and learn from them what are the challenges they're experiencing, and then build your solutions from that. I think too often, quote, experts want to come in and kind of impose their own understanding of what's going on in that community. And I think it's important that we recognize that the knowledge is already there. The awareness of what is needed is already there. And those of us that have the social cultural capital to want to make a difference, we have to go in knowing that we don't know everything. We have something to offer, but we have to understand from the people that live there, that are there, what they need, and start from there. And I think that's a big part of gaining that trust, is to recognize that they have all the answers. Our goal is just to support support them to address what they feel are the needs in their community.
Yeah, I agree with Reggie, and I'm happy to hear Enola and the call to action. I'm not surprised. I saw her microphone go off. I was like, yeah. I think also it's something very important that we need to talk about, or if not talk about, definitely not tonight, but deeply think about. And it's something that Enola kind of alludes to in her mission. But how do Black people feel about Black people, right? And I think that's a really critical question. And I say that because, and Karen knows as well, I'm in, Concorp is engaged in this $200 million project at Dixwell Plaza that Karen has been a deep thought partner on with me. And what has astonished me was the kind of vitriol and, the vitriol from Black folks in the community as it relates to the intention of this Black organization, Black-led organization called Concorp, that we are agents of Yale, that we are coming to gentrify and bring white folks into the community. And I understood two things. One, my fault was I presented the project more than I presented myself. That's number one. Secondly, there was a deep sense of brokenness from around our people, such that the fact that a Black group could come in and purchase property for the benefit of that community, it almost felt like Black folks did not believe that Black people could do that there had to be a white counterpart driving their mission. And so to me, there has to be a deeper conversation and thought process around how we feel about each other, right? What is some of the psychic pain we have in relation to how we look at Black success or even Black excellence? So I just want to, I think we need to surface that a little bit at some point.
You need to surface it a lot.
And tell our truth.
You have to surface it a lot because it is at the root.
Yes.
I mean, we can
right.
want to do all kinds of things intellectually and not have the emotional and psychological muscles to lift them. And a big part of what needs to happen in our community is to really deeply understand and practically deal with our conditioning. I mean, we are conditioned not to trust, and there are things that happen historically that make that not so unreasonable. So we do have to confront those issues, and there's a sense in which, in the absence of that, as is obvious, we will not make the progress that we need to make.
I love the way Enola talks about it being in the air that we all breathe in and move around in. And so when I talk about anti-Blackness, I'm not talking solely about something that white people feel about Black folk, but Black folk have taken on also a sense of anti-Blackness. And at the same time, we've been swimming through that same water, breathing that same water, breathing that same air. And so that deep sense lives within us as well.
Oh, and deliberately so. I mean, that is a big part of the plan, right? A big part of the benefit plan from their point of view.
Yeah, and part of that big lie that I think that Ms. Bear talks about is this notion that Black people are inferior. Right? What is so intentional and purposeful to espouse that belief, and it's in our school curriculum, right? It's how teachers look at us. It's what we read, right? It's pretty pervasive through the lives in terms of what kids see and what they don't see about themselves, right? And their history and their people. So it is very purposeful. One thing that, and you all can correct me, but I've lived in Connecticut 20 years now. It's hard to believe that time has gone by so quickly. And this might be a little bit controversial, but in every state I've lived in before Connecticut, there was some kind of cultural institution dedicated to Blackness, right? You had the Shrine of the Black Madonna in Houston. You had the Disabled Museum in Chicago. South Carolina has some things there. I don't see that in Connecticut, right? I don't see that place where young people can go and get grounded in their history, their sense of Blackness, right? And the greatness of Black people. I think that's missing. I think that's really missing in Connecticut. And to just in some way to help, I love what the state is doing about infusing Blackness and brownness in the curriculum. I think that's great. It's a good start. But where is the institution that is dedicated to teaching our young people and adults about themselves? I don't see a bricks and mortar place like some other states have. As I just wanted to pose it to the panelists and see what you all think about that. I personally think it's needed.
Well, I can tell you as someone who grew up in New Haven that we had the Panther Party and we had the schools that they gave, the Saturday morning schools along with breakfast in the morning. And Imam Jimmy Jones used to run something for young people on Goff Street because I attended it 2 summers, and it was focused on economics, education, history, self-pride. But that goes back to, unfortunately, during that day and time, funding. Where'd the funding come from and where did it go? I believe that program was possibly sponsored by the Urban League back then. And we've always had the Dixwell Q House and our churches. So we might be different in how we disseminate the information, but it has been there. And I think now when you start to look at that question again, we're coming around to having the Q House again. And so for the 21st century, it probably will look a lot different than it did in the 20th. And with that, we're definitely over 8 o'clock. I hope that we got to most of the questions that we did get in the Q&A. I'd like to thank all the panelists, Dr. Philip A. Goff, Eric Clemens, Dr. Reginald Simmons, Dr. Paul White, Howard K. Hill, Karen DuBose Walton, and Enola Aird for their insight and their time this evening. We thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
And Kai Perry's on to give a little bit more information. So hold on, folks. Don't go anywhere just yet.
Oh, Michelle, thank you so much. I thought you were going to handle that for me. But I just wanted to send out a couple more thank yous. One to Tom Thurston and to Daniel Vieri. I hope I didn't mess up your name too much, from the Gilder Lehrman Center at Yale University, for hosting this with us. All the committee members of the Amistad Committee and the Connecticut 29th Regiment. And special thank you to Meredith Benson, one of our co-chairs for tomorrow's Juneteenth celebration. So we invite all of you to come out tomorrow to 230 Ashman Street. We're there from 12 to 5 p.m. Lots and lots of fun activities ready for you guys tomorrow. So with that, I think That's all, folks. Hope to see you tomorrow. Thank you so much.
And don't forget, here's another conversation coming in regard to reparations from the Amistad Committee and the descendants of the Connecticut 29th Colored Regiment. Thank you. Good night.